Hello, we'll start in a couple of minutes. I'm just waiting for a few more people to arrive. Okay, I think we'll get started. So first of all, thank you all for coming. Just a little bit of housekeeping as usual. Um, so yeah, note this is going to be recorded and we'll have it on YouTube shortly with all the rest of the videos in this series. Please keep your microphone and your cameras off so we can focus in on the speaker and their presentation. And if we're going to take questions at the end as usual, but if you have any questions, we do that all through the chat. So I'm Stephen Haven. I'm a digital and data consultant, and I'm very pleased to introduce this special sort of value in energy data seminar where we're kind of talking about sort of the work here at the Catapult. Whereas previously we've introduced sort of other speakers. I'd be very pleased to introduce Richard Dobson, who's going to be talking about who's the business leader here at the digital here at the Energy Systems Catapult, and he supports a team of software developers, data scientists, data consultants, and operations specialists to deliver net zero centric digital innovations. Richard's also led a range of data-centric policy and innovation projects, and you might be aware of the Energy Data Taskforce and the Energy Digitalisation Taskforce. And prior to joining ESC, Richard worked in the telecom sector, focusing on technology strategy. And at King's College London was developing energy efficient algorithms. So I'm very excited for this talk today. So let me introduce Richard, who's going to talk about digital and data in the energy sector, current developments and future innovations.
Hello, thank you very much for the intro. Right, let me share my slide. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming along today. It's nice to be able to kind of join the very prestigious lineup from Steve's Value in Energy Data seminars. They've been really great over the last few months, and it's great to be able to kind of share a little bit about what we've been doing in the sector, the progress we've seen, particularly around digitalisation and data within the energy sector, and kind of touch on a few challenges that continue to exist and some of the innovations that are happening around them. So to start, I thought I'd give a little bit of an overview about what the Energy Systems Catapult is. Hopefully most of you are already aware of this, given that you're here. But the Energy Systems Catapult is part of a network of Catapult organisations that were set up by government a few years ago now, with the idea of really trying to help kind of turbocharge UK innovation. So each Catapult is focused on a different sector where there are some really knotty problems that need lots of research and innovation, and the innovators in that area are particularly fantastic in the UK, and they need a little bit more help to scale up and to develop their products and services and also to kind of expand internationally. So within the Energy Systems Catapult, we get to focus on particularly innovations around the energy sector and innovations that are going to help to get us to net zero. And we do this through working with research and innovation funding. We do this through working with research and innovation funding, innovators themselves who come to us with their nascent products and services that they're looking to grow and develop and expand further. And we also help to work with the government and regulators across the country to really help them to understand what they can be doing to help accelerate innovation that is going to help us to get to net zero. Within the Catapult, we have a range of different capabilities that are able to help innovators. So I cover the digital area, where we have consultants, software developers, data scientists, all who can help really drive innovation within the net zero space. But we also have consumer insight specialists, we have engineers and technology specialists, systems engineering and systems integration experts, and an absolute plethora of other experts that can really help to get to the bottom of some of the knotty problems that exist. So, as Steve trailed a little bit at the start of this, one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time on over the last almost 5 years that I've been at the Catapult is working on the Energy Data and Energy Digitalisation Taskforces. So when I first joined the Catapult, we were just starting to really get our teeth stuck into digitalisation and data. We'd previously used digital technologies to develop new products and services and to trial things with innovators. But really, we weren't particularly active in trying to influence the wider sector or government or regulator. And the Energy Data Task Force was kind of the start of changing that, and really helped us to get a much better understanding of what the challenges are within the energy sector, particularly surrounding data, access to data, quality, and driving innovation and net zero through the use of data. We worked with Laura Sands as the chair of the task force to help really get to the bottom of the problems, understand what the possible solutions might be, and make some recommendations to government and the regulator. We started that back in, or we published that back in 2019 now, so that's quite a way off. And since then, we have gone back to work with BEIS and Ofgem and Innovate UK on the Energy Digitalisation Task Force, where we were taking the findings and the work we'd done on the Energy Data Task Force and pushing them forwards even further, really focusing around digital technologies and how that can be better integrated into the sector and how that will help to unlock the opportunities across the sector. Thinking particularly about things like flexibility and new products and services. So I've got some very simple slides, but I'm just going to talk around some themes that I think are really interesting. I'm going to leave a bit of time for questions at the end. So if there are things that you think you'd like me to go into more detail on, or any specific questions you have, please drop them in the chat. I'll try and leave a decent amount of time so we've got time to crack through a little bit of it. But yeah, please do ask questions because there's a lot of stuff that we just can't possibly cover. So since we started looking at digitalisation and data in the energy sector, there's been a huge amount of progress. Now, some of that is obviously been to do with the Catapult and helping to drive things directly. A lot of that has been to do with innovators and industry really stepping up to the mark and starting to develop solutions and to really solve some of these problems. I'm really glad we've been able to help them in some places, but there's definitely been a massive team effort to pull this all forwards. So there's a few kind of highlight areas that I wanted to pick on here. So I think firstly, open data. Within the energy sector, we have been on a journey around open data over the last 3-4 years now, moving from really a sector where we didn't consider open data as a as a viable thing for commercial entities to even be thinking about, and where open data was pretty much restricted to innovation projects where they had to publish, to one where actually there are a number of sources of open data that have started to be created over the last few years and published in an open, permissible, licensed way. And it's not just innovation projects, not just innovators, it's across the whole sector. So I think if I was to kind of call out some highlights of things that have happened over the last few years, I think definitely seeing Alexon and who are the managers of the Balancing and Settlement Code, pushing to have presumed open as part of their as part of their code conditions. So now any data that is generated by the Balancing and Settlement codes and the operation of that is presumed open. It can be requested. They will triage it. They will understand whether it's possible to publish that in a safe way or not. That's a huge step forwards. We've worked really closely with what was WPD, but is now National Grid Electricity Distribution, to help them to consider the data sets that they have available within their organisation and which ones they can publish openly. You may have seen over the last few years, there's been a huge amount of data being published by what was WPD, now National Grid Electricity Distribution. And we've been really helping them to understand what the value of that data is, who might want to engage with it. Steve has particularly been working with them on data science challenges and really trying to engage people with the data that they can produce, and because that creates the feedback loop. So them publishing information is great, it being used is fantastic, but then when we can get those two sides talking to one another, we can start to accelerate the amount of data that's published because it's easier to justify it, and also the impact that can be had off the back of that. WPD are by no means the only distribution network, or National Grid Electricity Distribution, sorry, that's going to take me a long time to get used to, are definitely not the only distribution network that's been doing some great work here. UKPN now have a new open data portal and a lot of open data processes that help them to understand their maturity in the background. So that's really amazing. There's lots of good data coming out of there and things you wouldn't necessarily think about. Things like soil testing data, which you don't necessarily think about when you're talking about an electricity distribution network, but is really important and is really valuable to lots of other people who are working on the physical infrastructure projects in those areas. We've also seen lots of other innovators publishing data. We've seen huge amounts of information being made available and being utilised critically. So we've also been supporting the Modernising Energy Data Applications projects, which was an Innovate UK funded competition, where initially 9 and then 6 innovators went forwards to develop applications that are using open data and developing real products and services. And we've seen some fantastic stuff come of that. So some really valuable products and services being developed largely off the back of open data. That wouldn't have been possible 4 or 5 years ago. Alongside open data, we've also seen huge strides forwards in the regulatory environment. We don't necessarily think about regulation as being very fast moving and dynamic. It does take a long time to change these things, but actually Ofgem and the digitalisation team within Ofgem have moved faster than I've ever seen the regulator move particularly within the digitalisation and data space, to really develop some modern pragmatic regulation that has helped to push the open data agenda and the digitalisation agenda much more rapidly than we could ever have imagined. So in particular, energy data best practice or data best practice guidance has been developed. It's now part of the RIIO-2 license conditions. So that applies currently to electricity and gas transmission and gas distribution. It will apply for the electricity distribution networks very soon. And within data best practice guidance, which all of those networks either have to or will have to comply with, it puts forward a really pragmatic approach to what is a modern way of managing energy data and how should they be engaging with the wider sector. Critically, it embeds the principle of presumed open, so making sure that data is published as openly as possible. But it also puts forward lots of really pragmatic stuff around metadata and stakeholder engagement and storage and archiving of data. There's lots of really great stuff in there. And that has gone from not even being a thought to draft regulation being developed, and that was something that Catapult were fortunate enough to work on with the team who were in post at the time. That has then been taken by Ofgem, and in particular Greg Johnson, who now works at the Energy Systems Catapult. He took that initial draft and turned it into something that could be actual regulatory license conditions. And then that has been implemented into formal license conditions for some of the networks already, and will soon be for the final network organisations. And that is lightning speed. That's incredible. And I think the beauty of data best practice guidance is that it was written in a way that isn't specifically about network data. It can apply to any different type of data, which means that over the coming years, that could very easily be rolled out to different types of organizations. It doesn't have to just be networks. Anyone can pick up the guidance and start using it. But from a regulatory point of view, Ofgem could quite easily roll this out to different parts of their regulated sectors. Equally, the water sector could pick it up, the telecom sector could pick it up, because it's all written in the context of data rather than the context of energy, which is really interesting. So that's very cool. We've also seen some big strides forwards in terms of the digitalisation strategy and action plans, which are now a mandated part of the Rio 2 process. So we're seeing huge amounts of ambition from the networks who are publishing their digitalisation strategies and action plans, where they are all putting forwards what they think they're going to be doing over the next few years. And quite critically, Ofgem have been able to be quite flexible with that. So they've enabled the networks to say, here's what I think I'm going to do, but I'm going to refine that, and I'm going to become more specific over the time period, because digitalization is moving faster than any of us could have imagined. So we're able to kind of change the budgets. So there are reopeners that are included in the regulation to enable us to look again and say, actually, maybe we don't need that bit anymore, or maybe we do need a new bit. So we're able to review as we go forwards, which is really great. We've also seen digitalization included in the talk of the FSO, the Future System Operator. Data and digitalization have been mentioned in that context. So as that develops, we imagine we'll see some interesting stuff there. Excuse me. And we've also seen things like the Retail Energy Code. The organisations around that have taken a really modern view of digitalisation. So we're really starting to see some exciting stuff coming out of regulation, which I'm a bit of a regulation, policy and regulation geek, but I think this is exciting for us as kind of digitalisation and data people and tech people in general, that the policy and regulation is aligning with the direction of travel that we want, and is going to be starting enabling more innovation, which is always good. The final thing to call out is digitalisation. So I've already mentioned that there is a regulatory support for digitalisation strategy and action plans. So that's already really good. But we have started to see some huge amounts of progress around the actual digitalisation of the energy system. So this is the integration of digital technologies into existing systems and building new systems that are inherently digital from the ground up. We've seen some really fantastic business models coming out to support this. I always like to talk about the EA technology monitoring solutions, where they are selling essentially a service. So they're able to put fantastic piece of hardware, but a relatively low cost piece of hardware into hub sites. But then they're able to take that data, extract value, put intelligence on the top of it, and sell services from that. It's a really cool model because it means that we're able to get outcomes that we care about rather than pay for capital investment up front. It's a really interesting model. So that's very cool. But we're also seeing things like the Strategic Innovation Fund, which is Ofgem's kind of landmark innovation funding competition in collaboration with Innovate UK. And we're seeing digitalisation streams within that. We're seeing digitalisation across all of the other verticals. So we're starting to see digitalisation be put front and centre time and time again, and lots of organisations are taking this very seriously, particularly new innovators. Particularly new innovators are really pushing this. So huge amounts of progress, really great. Is absolutely not all solved, of course, because if it was, we wouldn't be here. We'd be sitting in our net zero energy system, not worrying about energy costs at all. But we are where we are, and there's still more work to be done. There are lots of challenges, but I'm going to pick out some of the key themes that I think still are challenges for us. The first one is shared data. So we're starting to move quite quickly towards open data, and particularly in the kind of the regulated monopoly parts of the sector, we're seeing open data coming forwards really quite effectively, and actually adopting genuinely open licenses for that data. They're not all entirely consistent, so there is some difference between who's using a government-based open license and those who are using Creative Commons based open licenses, and some who have created their own, which perhaps is slightly more complicated. So there is a little bit of a confusion about what is compatible with what. But in the shared data space, it's still kind of very bespoke. We haven't quite got to the level of maturity there where we're able to say, I'm an organisation, I'm happy to share my data with you. Here are my standard terms and conditions. Here's my standard license. Go forth and use that self-serve. And I think really that's where we would like to get to, because we know there is a lot of data in the energy sector that can't be entirely open. Smart meter data, as much as I would love for it to be open, will not be open because it is deemed personal data, and that means that it can't be open to everybody. It can be quite permissive. We can give it to a lot of people, but not everybody. So shared data is going to be really important. There are many challenges around shared data, particularly around, how do you have trust within a shared data ecosystem? How do you have the right levels of security? How do you understand when someone has access, for what reason, and when to revoke that access? And how do you track what they've done with it? There's lots of really big problems there. But there are some exciting things going on in that space, which I'll talk about on the next slide, that really are helping to push that forwards. But it's definitely not solved quite yet. And in particular, we don't have really strong direction from government or the regulator to say this is the solution that we want you to use, and that will be the thing that really pushes us over the edge and gets us to a good space. Put the big one in the middle here of interoperability. So digitalisation and data are going to be transformational in the sector. They're already essential to its operation, but they're going to be absolutely transformational going forwards. If we have to translate between data sets going forwards, particularly for ones that are of very high usage, because they're in different formats, because they've used different units, they've not described things in the same way, that's going to be a real blocker to getting the real value out of it. And equally, if we have lots of silos of digitalization that can't really talk to each other that well and need to go through translation layers, that's going to absolutely minimize the value of digitalization and make it so much more complex for the customer. Before I came into the energy sector, I worked in telecoms, and particularly in consumer products. I spent a little bit of time there looking at IoT and smart home and the offerings around that. And really, what we were looking at back then, which was some quite well-formed silos that within their ecosystem worked quite well, but were absolutely not interoperable with other things, still exists. So, you know, if you go all in for a Google-based Internet of Things, smart home ecosystem, it works well. It works fine. If you go for an Apple-based one, or if you go for an Amazon-based one, like they all work well. They don't work well together. And we're essentially having big corporate giants doing the integration layer over the top. So Google are, you know, helping to integrate lots of different devices through their voice control systems, and Amazon doing the same, and Apple are doing the same. There's so many others. But what that means is that you end up with, it's not really interoperable, but there's a lot of engineering going on in the background to make it work. And ultimately, if the customer wants to switch out their voice assistant, it's a really challenging thing. That's where we're at in the energy sector with digitalisation right now. There's a lot of really good progress, but there aren't the standards and there aren't the commonly used open source solutions that would really help to make it truly interoperable. So in terms of interoperability, I'm glad to say there is quite a lot going on here, and there are a lot of things happening. I think probably the biggest one to note, the biggest kind of win so far, has been the Common Information Model. This is a standard that was been produced by the IEC a number of years ago. It's not a new standard by any means, and is still being actively developed and worked on. And that Common Information Model standard has really helped to give us a common language for network data and for network operations more broadly, actually. And excuse me. So that's been really important, and that's been really valuable. But it's existed for a long time, and we haven't had the adoption in the UK that we've seen it elsewhere in the world. And the reason is that it's, you know, as with every standard, particularly international ones, it's not quite perfect. It doesn't maybe do exactly what we want it to in the UK. It doesn't exactly have all of the functionality we would hope for. But it's absolutely the best solution that's out there, and it is the closest to being right that we have available. We've seen some really great working group progress around the ENA have been taking on SIM and been trying to work out what would need to be done to produce a GB specific profile for SIM. So how should you implement SIM in the GB electricity network context? And we've also seen some really interesting discussions around, could we use a similar approach for gas networks? Is that possible? Are we able to create a standard that would help us talk about gas networks? And then you can kind of go on from there of, what about heat networks? What about hydrogen? What about CCUS? Like, these are all network relevant technologies and solutions, and really having that level of interoperability across those data sets would be really, really valuable. The best thing that's happened for SIM over the last few years has been Ofgem announcing that it will be the standard for the long-term development statement publications that the electricity distribution networks have to make on a periodic basis. That means that there is a genuine business reason for electricity distribution networks to adopt the Common Information Model. And that's really exciting, because that means that they're able to start publishing it more effectively. They're able to start adopting it because they have to publish in that format, so it makes sense to have it natively in that format. I've just seen a question pop up around the Common Information Model, and particularly the fact that it isn't an open standard, and that is genuinely the big downside. We have to come at this from quite a pragmatic base, and the challenge we have is it is pretty well formed, and it does address a lot of the problems. It's not ideal that it's not an open standard. I would love for it to be an open standard, and I would love to be more open source tools to allow people to interact with it. We're not quite there with it, but I hope that by driving the adoption of it, we will help to drive the case for investment in open source solutions to work with it. There are a few open source toolkits that allow you to interact with the SIM data. They are at the minute they have been created by kind of people on best efforts, so they're not being actively managed, but hopefully we might see some of those being picked up a little bit more. It's not perfect, but it's the best step we could see available. The next challenge I wanted to talk about was shared digital infrastructure. So the energy sector is inherently a monopoly-based sector. We don't want to have multiple physical networks running into everyone's house so they can physically change network when they want to change supplier. Clearly, we don't need that. We need efficient, well-sized networks that can be used by lots of different people. That means we inherently have monopolies. And within the physical infrastructure side of the sector, we kind of get that and we accept it. And we've come up with lots of regulatory frameworks that allow us to create, in some ways, quite artificial competition, but competition nonetheless, which helps to drive efficiencies within the operation of those physical monopolies. Digital doesn't necessarily have the same characteristics. Digital can be very competitive natively. The challenges around that sometimes, though, are that if you have competitive digital solutions for things, they can have quite low incentives to collaborate and to be interoperable with each other because they're competing. So why would they want to be interoperable with each other? And equally, we can end up investing in the same kind of background infrastructure for every single one of the competitive solutions in a particular place. And when it's a highly competitive market where you can do lots of innovation on top of it, that's maybe fine. But in a infrastructure sector where there is a kind of we all want the sector to work as effectively as possible, to be as low carbon as possible and low cost as possible, there's a lot of areas where we probably don't need to have competitive solutions in place, which kind of leads us down the route of shared digital infrastructure. Within the Energy Digitalisation Taskforce, we talked about this as public interest digital assets. And what we were trying to say was that there are things that really we should just share across the sector. We don't need multiple data sharing solutions for things like security and verification and authentication. We need one good one that we all agree in and we have faith in. We probably don't want to have multiple standards for flexible energy assets or smart energy assets. We want to just have one base standards that people can build on and innovate on top of, because then that creates the base level of interoperability we want, but without kind of increasing, without restricting the ability for commercial organizations to innovate on top of it. Shared digital infrastructure is still a challenge because government and the regulator they weren't set up to fund and to continue to fund and maintain those solutions. The regulator is really not within their remit because their remit is essentially to drive competition within a monopoly sector, not create new monopolies themselves. And the government maybe don't have a huge amount of experience developing shared digital infrastructure. It's not something that they've done many times before, and the few examples that do exist where we do have shared digital infrastructure, there's not been a cookie cutter, one size fits all way of developing and maintaining that. They're all quite varied and it's all quite different. They're all quite unique. So we're still navigating that and it's still a challenge. I strongly believe that there is a case for significant amounts of shared digital infrastructure that drives efficiency, that enables innovation to come and build on top of it. And we've made the case for that in the Digitalisation Taskforce. But we haven't quite worked out how to do that just yet. But there are some kind of glimpses of progress there, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. Okay, so what innovations are actually happening So in terms of shared data, apologies, these bubbles are the wrong way around because I had a last minute rejig and I missed this slide clearly. In terms of shared data, there is a emerging solution that it seems sensible for us to get behind. Innovate UK, Ofgem and BEIS had a innovation competition called Modernising Energy Data Access. They essentially asked for innovators to come along and put proposals forwards for digital solutions that would help to modernise the way we access energy data across the sector. It was a relatively well-funded competition. There was a fair amount of money available. They funded 3 discovery projects, 2 alpha projects, and 1 beta project. The one project that got all the way through there was led by a not-for-profit organisation called Icebreaker One, and the solution they developed was open energy. It is entirely based on open banking, a very well-developed, well-understood technology stack, very high-grade security, authentication and verification processes that have already been developed and deployed all over the world. And they've picked up that, they've worked out what works in the energy sector, what doesn't work, where we need to change and modify things, and they've deployed it. And open energy is a thing that exists. It's not the final solution. It's not like a absolutely done and ready to just roll out en masse, because obviously they're still developing, but it's a really good solution for sharing data, particularly when that data can't be open. It's a good way of securing data, understanding who you're sharing with, having trust that you know who you're sharing with, and understanding what you can do with that data when you collect it from that entity. We've published a few things in the Catapult now that really kind of show that we have some faith in this as a solution, and we think that really we're now at the stage where this just needs to be picked up and in some areas of the energy sector mandated as the way to share energy. There are going to be niggles, there are going to be things that aren't perfect, but from a pragmatic point of view of taking the thing that is the most developed and the most likely to deliver the outcomes we're looking for, open energy is there. And the nice thing about Icebreaker One is that they're not just focused on the energy sector. They're now looking at water, they're looking at transport, they're looking at EVs, because they consider net zero to be their drive, their aim, not decarbonising the energy sector. So we're going to get some benefits from doing this first, and we're going to get lots of benefits when the open energy, where I think they have a open net zero branding as well now. So it's going to expand further, and the energy sector potentially could benefit from this. There's lots of cool stuff going on in Icebreaker One. I'm not the person to tell you about it all. Go to their website, have a look. I know there's some things that are on the horizon that are really exciting, so keep an eye out for that stuff, because there's some cool stuff going on there, and potentially it's a really great opportunity for us to get ahead within the UK energy sector as well. In terms of interoperability, I've already talked about the common information model. Not perfect, but definitely a useful part of the toolkit. But we've also seen a lot of work going on around, particularly thinking about interoperability of smart energy appliances or flexible energy assets. So think behind the meter, potentially domestic scale up to kind of relatively large industrial and commercial assets that can be flexible in terms of their energy demand, and potentially could be part of the system that enables us to balance when we have intermittent renewable generation that's not as controllable as fossil fuel based generation. It's going to enable us to have that flexibility within the system to make sure everything balances out. There's been quite a lot of work going on in this area, and in the UK, the BSI have been leading on the development of there's 2 PAS standards. that have been developed around the concept of energy smart appliances, one talking specifically about the devices and one talking about the control of those devices and how that might work. They are early stage standards, like they are relatively well developed, but there's still more to be done. And there are definitely questions around exactly what the implementation looks like and how it should be controlled and who should have authority over it. But again, it's the best thing we've got available at the minute. There might be something better in the future, but it's looking really good. And BEIS, the Government Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, have been running a work stream around the smart, secure energy system. This is really interesting and really exciting because they're pushing forward a lot of digitalisation focused initiatives. So firstly, they're picking up the energy smart appliances standards as a way of working. They're thinking about a common approach to security across smart energy appliances. They're thinking about how government can best be involved in delivering these things. So what should government's role be in terms of funding and overseeing the delivery of some of the core common infrastructure? And they're also thinking about the regulatory setup for flexible energy assets. And I'm really pleased to say that we've been working quite closely with them, trying to help advise, and not in necessarily a formal role, but being able to kind of be a critical friend and help with the development and feeding into the consultation like everyone else could. But in particular, we produced a report around the digitalisation of licensing and how digital technologies can be used to improve and modernise the licensing environment in the energy sector, as well as improve the operational environment. And that's another piece of work that Greg Johnston's been working on, and that has been really influential, helping the government and the regulator to think about, do we need to produce heavyweight licenses that apply to every organisation in a class from day one? Or can we be a little bit more pragmatic and say, if you're only small, you might only need to do a limited amount to be compliant with a license. But as you grow and as you become more important to the overall stability of the system, you perhaps have slightly more onerous regulations that you need to comply with. And that seems sensible, particularly with flexibility, where there will be some players that have very small amounts of devices and very limited ability to materially impact the system, and then we'll have the big giants that might be able to have hundreds of megawatts available to them at any moment in time in quite specific locations. We need to be able to have a regulatory environment that covers everyone in a pragmatic way. Alongside that, we've also been producing some reports and some thought leadership reports around, around algorithmic governance. So, as we know, when we have thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of devices that need to be controlled to make sure the energy system is stable, clearly that's not going to be done in a manual way. There's going to be algorithms that are responsible for controlling those systems. We also know, looking at other sectors like financial services and stock markets, we know that algorithms are fallible and they can be fooled into doing things that create instability within systems. When that's instability in financial has great impact, but ultimately the system itself can weather that storm. It can continue to be stable. With an electricity system or an energy system more generally, we don't have the ability to allow the system to go a bit skew-whiff whilst the markets sort themselves out. We have to maintain the integrity of the system because it's very expensive to fix it when it goes wrong, and also it has a huge impact on people's lives because, you know, blackouts are not what anybody wants, and particularly not vulnerable people who are very dependent on energy to be healthy and happy and alive. So we've been producing we've produced a report around algorithmic governance. So how should the regulator be thinking about the plethora of algorithms that are going to start becoming increasingly more important to the operation of the energy system, how we should be getting out ahead of this issue rather than waiting for something to go wrong and then scrambling to try and put some regulation in place, because as we know, no good regulation comes out of a crisis. You have to have some time to think about it and plan and make good judgments on what is useful. And there's lots of other thought processes that need to go on behind the scenes there, but we're seeing the government and the regulator really step up in this area and really start to put some good thought and process behind how we can make a secure and stable energy system. The final thread I wanted to touch on here was around the shared digital infrastructure and particularly the innovation fund that's being pumped into this. So the government have put a lot of money into net zero innovation in the UK. We would always like it to be more. We would always like there to be a more drive and focus and all of this sort of stuff. But there is still a lot of money available through innovation competitions. And in particular, we've seen BEIS pushing forwards a number of really great innovation competitions that are helping to deploy some of, or at least helping to design and develop some of the things that potentially become shared digital infrastructure. So in particular, we've seen automatic asset registration. There is a live competition on right now. There are 3 projects, I believe, actively working on this issue. There is currently a call out for the digital spine, which is essentially a solution that will help to drive interoperability across operational data. And there are a number of innovation competitions around flexible smart energy assets and deploying standards compliant solutions in that area. Within the Catapult, we've had the great privilege of being involved in one of the successful automatic asset registration projects. So we're working on that with an Australian innovator who has got some really interesting solutions, and we're helping them to understand what might be relevant in the UK setting and how well aligned they might be with the overarching digital strategy of the sector, and helping them to think about kind of what might a deployment look like and how might that be managed and governed going forwards. So we've been really privileged to be involved in that, but there are other competitions going on there as well. There's also the Smart Meter Energy Data Repository project, which I don't believe is quite public, so it's not for me to announce, but we know there is a really exciting project consortium that is getting through there. So that's going to be really interesting to see how that goes over the next few months and into next year, because they will be looking at improving the access to smart meter data en masse, which will be really cool. And I guess I just need to touch on, there is always huge amounts of innovation funding coming from Innovate UK, from UKRI more generally, and also from Ofgem through the Strategic Innovation Fund. We're seeing huge amounts of investment going into digitalisation more broadly, and in many cases producing digital infrastructure that could be shared much more widely. And I say widely, not just in the energy sector, across other sectors. I've been speaking to the water sector quite a lot recently, because they're going through similar sort of journey of trying to think about how they open up their data, how they share it more effectively, how they use that data to achieve their goals. They've got some big old environmental challenges, just like the energy sector has, and opening up data is going to be massively valuable for them as well. So that is kind of where I wanted to get to. I've managed to leave about 10 minutes for questions, which I'm astounded that I managed to keep to time. So that's good. But thank you very much for listening, and thank you for the questions that come in. If you have anything else, please throw it in the chat, and Steve and I will try and work out what we need to answer and how we do it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That was great. I have a quick one before we move to the chat. It's just as you mentioned, sort of digitalization is moving quite fast. Sort of accelerating really. So quite an open question really, but I guess it's more about what your views would be about sort of the data and digital skills that might be therefore needed. That's a bit of something I like
Yeah.
to talk about.
A very leading question from Steve. So yeah, I think we know that digital and data skills are essential for many parts of the modern economy. We know that already. We've seen demand increasing across sectors that never really cared too much about it. Fintech is huge in the UK now. There's also a relatively limited pool of people that are being trained to come through here, and the competition for those graduates and the competition for those skilled individuals, however they've been trained, is really high, and the energy sector is competing with a very healthy market for those sort of skills. But in addition, we also need energy and people who have those technical skills to also understand the energy sector, because having that contextual information is so important, particularly with things like data science. That's really key, because someone who understands the technical models and methods but doesn't understand the context is just dangerous. They will come up with the wrong solutions and the wrong conclusions. So yeah, there's a real issue. One of my very good colleagues has been spending a lot of time working on digital and data skills across the energy sector, and we've been really looking at where are the gaps, how might we fill them, and how might we encourage the sector and also training providers to really start to work on this together collaboratively. We published earlier this year a piece of work around academic collaboration with industry, particularly around data science in the energy sector. And that report produced a huge amount of really interesting insight that shows why there are challenges that exist with those two types of organizations coming together. There's huge benefits, but there's also lots of challenges. And just to be specific, Steve has been working on a lot of this stuff. So I'm, there's some really good reports. Take a look at the ESC website here.
Oh, that's very leading, but thank you very much for the answer. So I'll get to the chat questions. So Robbie asks about a sort of two-part question, really. What definition for open data is touchstone, and does this include the unrestricted right to redistribute in original and modified forms? And sort of second part really is how is legal interoperability handled with regard to license choice?
Really good questions. I sort of started to touch on them a little bit here. I saw that one pop up, and I thought I might have guessed the question from the little snippet I got. So we work with an organisation called Open UK. They are the kind of trade body / advocate for open technology and solutions within the UK. They have been working with us on what definitions of open should be adopted in the sector. So there are obviously a number of open licenses or licenses that could be considered open. I think within the energy sector, really, and what we're talking to various people across the kind of policy and regulatory landscape about in a minute is making sure that open is not, we're not restricting commercial use of that data, because that is really important. We need to allow commercial reuse of it, and as just fundamentally part of an open data definition, the ability to take, modify, redistribute, I think that really needs to be part of that. I think if you look at the UKPN Open Data Portal, they've adopted, I believe, a Creative Commons style approach, but I'm sure someone will correct me in the chat if that's not right. National Grid Electricity Distribution, so like how I caught myself there, have a one that's based on the Open Government License. So it's not quite the same, but it's definitely getting there. It's quite close. Legal interoperability across these things is really challenging. it's one of the reasons why Open Energy exists and is really important, because they will make sure that all of their licenses are interoperable with each other. So even if it's a more restrictive license or a more open license, there will be threads that run through to make sure that they actually work together, and you don't end up having two licenses that in theory deliver the same but mean that you can't join those data sets, because that would be a challenge. The E&A have also been doing some really interesting work on this, and that's particularly around license for flexibility contracts. So we need to get the interoperability right there, but also data and also digitalisation assets. It's a really important point. There isn't a perfect solution yet. I believe Ofgem might be, as part of their request for information about data best practice guidance, there is an opportunity to feed in thoughts about the licensing or the licenses that are used. And I know that they have considered refining the specifying a set of licenses that work nicely together.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So
are you on mute? No, you're not.
Can you hear? Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, thanks for that. So actually, we have Yuxing from UKPN who agrees that you were correct about license, and also shared the open data portal. There's a question from Bekaran about can you give some examples maybe of the shared digital infrastructure you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so we kind of grouped it into a few parts. So there's shared data infrastructure. I really believe there is a need for an open data catalog, like a catalog that shows what data exists in different organizations across the sector, because a large part of our job at the Catapult ends up being helping people to find data and information. It shouldn't be that hard. You shouldn't need lots of specialist knowledge like we have. So we're still driving for that. So a data catalog that shows you where data is, not necessarily gives you access to it, but just shows you what exists. Data sharing infrastructure, I believe that should be shared digital infrastructure. It should be a public interest digital asset available for all. Standards and open source implementations of common solutions, so particularly things like flexibility standards and network data standards. I believe that's shared digital infrastructure. And then probably the thing that's getting closest to the biggest things are things like the digital spine. I don't have enough time to go into the proposal there, but if you look at the Energy Digitalisation Taskforce, it's described in there. And there's also an innovation competition that pays the funding around it that will be kick-starting towards the end of this year, I would imagine.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. So we've come really to the end of the hour now. So I just want to say a big thank you again for your presentation. It was really interesting stuff. Please get in contact if you have further questions. We'll put this video up probably in the next few days, so it'll be available on our YouTube page, and we'll be sharing the slides, I believe, as well, in case anybody wants to view them. So yeah, well, once again, thank you very much, Richard, and yeah, so thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.